August 21st, 1942, east of the Ilu River, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The morning heat rose off the jungle floor in shimmering waves as the sound of cicadas merged with the dull hum of distant artillery. Along a clearing littered with palm trunks and wrecked equipment, a squad of U.S. Marines approached what at first glance looked like a burnout farm tractor. Then they saw the rising sun insignia faintly visible through the soot. It was a tank, small, riveted, with thin metal plates that had buckled under machine gun fire. Private First Class Edward T. Dixon of Company Y, 1st Marine Division, remembered the moment in his field notes. "We thought it was some kind of toy. Couldn't believe the Japanese actually sent this thing into battle." The vehicle was a Type 95 Hago, Japan's standard light tank. Its 37mm gun pointed uselessly toward the trees, the barrel half melted by fire. The armor plating, no thicker than a truck's fender, had been torn open in several places. Nearby, a Marine gunnery sergeant set up his Browning M2 on its tripod. The order was simple: test fire. The first burst of 50-caliber armor-piercing rounds struck with sharp metallic cracks. They passed clean through the turret, exiting in pencil-sized holes on the far side. The Marines laughed in disbelief. One man ran a cleaning rod through a hole from side to side, grinning at the camera of a Marine Corps photographer. Within minutes, the laughter spread down the line. The myth of Japan's armored might, long feared after the fall of Singapore and the Philippines, had just been reduced to a spectacle. Corporal Frank Colby later wrote, "We'd been told their tanks were unstoppable, but our 50 cal went through it like a knife through tin. We didn't even need the 37s. The Hago's burned-out crew compartment smelled of oil and cordite. Its hatches were fused shut by heat. Inside, investigators would later find 2 Japanese tankers who never escaped when the vehicle was struck by anti-tank grenades and concentrated 50 cal fire. Around it lay empty shell casings, torn field maps, and fragments of the rising sun flag. Ordnance officers arrived within hours. They took measurements, thickness readings, and photographs for technical reports. The results astonished them. The tank's frontal armor averaged just 12mm, its sides barely 8mm, numbers that meant even rifle-caliber armor-piercing rounds could penetrate at close range. What had once been a fearsome silhouette in early war propaganda now looked fragile, outdated, and absurd against American firepower. As the sun dropped behind the coconut palms, Marines posed for pictures beside the wreck. Some climbed onto its hull, others carved graffiti into the soft steel. The war's illusions were beginning to fracture. The men who had faced the Hago that morning realized they were not fighting a mechanized juggernaut, but an empire built on brittle steel and fading confidence. The wreck was tagged for recovery. Within days, it would be shipped to the beachhead for ordnance study. The first captured Japanese tank to reveal what lay behind the armor of Japan's armored forces and the flawed doctrine that had sent it here. That doctrine had its origins years before Guadalcanal, in an army that prized speed and faith over protection. In the years before the Pacific War, Japanese strategists had come to believe that mobility, not armor, would decide battles in Asia. Their empire stretched across jungles, rice fields, and narrow island roads where heavy tanks would bog down. From the 1930s campaigns in China to the invasion of Malaya, the Imperial Japanese Army shaped its doctrine around light vehicles that could move quickly, fight infantry, and cross primitive bridges. The result was the Type 95 Hago, a 7.4-ton machine whose thin armor was never meant to withstand anti-tank fire. Engineers at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries designed it in 1934 under the supervision of Colonel Tomio Hara, the pioneer of Japan's tank program. He believed that the essence of tank warfare in Asia lay in reliability and maneuverability, not brute strength. In Japanese training manuals, The tank's role was described as the swift spearhead of the infantry. Speed and initiative would overcome any material disadvantage. During the China campaigns, that philosophy appeared vindicated. Against poorly armed Chinese troops, the Hago's 37mm Type 94 gun and twin 7.7mm machine guns performed well. Its diesel engine, producing just 120 horsepower, allowed it to cruise at 45 km/h on roads, impressive for the time. Yet this success fostered complacency. Japanese officers misread easy victories as proof of superior design. Few noticed that the Hago's riveted armor, only 12 mm at the thickest point, could barely resist rifle-caliber rounds. The turret was manually rotated by hand crank. The commander doubled as gunner and loader, leaving him overworked and half-blind in battle. The crew of 3 sat shoulder to shoulder in a space so cramped that even short Japanese soldiers struggled to operate efficiently. Colonel Hara's internal memoranda, preserved in the archives of the Ground Self-Defense Force, show a deep awareness of these flaws. He warned that the Hago was vulnerable to the new heavy guns of the Western armies, and that its protection was sufficient only against small arms fire. But wartime industry, limited by steel shortages and production quotas, could not produce heavier tanks without sacrificing numbers. By 1939, when Japanese units clashed with Soviet armor at Khalkhin Gol, those limits became painfully clear. Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 tanks with 45mm guns and sloped armor outranged and outgunned the Hagos entirely. Over 70 Japanese tanks were destroyed in a few days. Major General Yasuoka's report to the Army General Staff concluded, "Our tanks were slaughtered by superior firepower. The bravery of crews cannot compensate for iron." Instead of prompting a radical redesign, the defeat led to a paradoxical confidence. Commanders argued that such encounters were exceptional, that in the jungles of Southeast Asia, where anti-tank guns were scarce, speed would matter more than armor. The Army doubled down on its doctrine. New divisions were trained to use tanks as shock cavalry, advancing ahead of infantry to break defenses through terror and mobility. When Japan struck across the Pacific in December 1941, this doctrine seemed prophetic. Hagos led spearheads through Malaya and the Philippines, crossing rivers where Allied vehicles sank, and flanking positions thought impassable. To the Imperial Japanese Army, the victories validated every compromise of steel and design. They saw in the Hago not weakness, but proof that faith in movement could conquer a continent. But beneath that confidence lay a fatal assumption, that future enemies would remain as lightly armed and disorganized as those first overwhelmed garrisons. On the volcanic islands of the Pacific, that illusion would meet the reality of American firepower. The first to test it would be the very tankers who had driven these light machines through the jungles of Malaya and Luzon, believing themselves unstoppable. The captured Hago from Guadalcanal revealed a paradox of Japanese engineering: elegant simplicity masking fatal fragility. When U.S. ordnance officers began their inspection, they found construction methods more suited to a 1930s tractor than a frontline tank. The hull was made of riveted plates rather than welded armor, a technique already obsolete in Western designs. Each rivet, under impact, became a deadly fragment that could ricochet inside the crew compartment. The tank's dimensions spoke to its designer's priorities. It measured just 4.38 meter long, 2.06 meter wide, and 2.18 meter high, barely taller than a standing man. It weighed only 7.4 tons, light enough to be transported by rail, barge, or even crude pontoon. Beneath its thin plates sat a Mitsubishi NVD 6120 diesel engine, delivering 120 horsepower at 1,800 RPM, giving a top speed of 45 km/h on flat terrain. The range, approximately 200 kilometers, was respectable, but its 150-liter fuel capacity left little endurance for sustained operations. Mechanically, the Hago was reliable. American engineers noted that its air-cooled diesel seldom overheated even in tropical conditions. Its suspension, using bell cranks and coil springs, was praised for its smoothness. But reliability could not save it from the realities of modern firepower. The Type 94 37mm main gun, capable of penetrating only 30 millimeters of armor at 300 meters, was sufficient against interwar tankettes, not against the M3 Stuarts or Shermans it would soon face. Inside, the tank was claustrophobic to a degree that astonished American analysts. The commander, who also served as gunner and loader, had to operate 3 periscopes, the hand-cranked turret, and the 37mm gun simultaneously. The driver, seated to the left, controlled the vehicle through lever brakes rather than a steering wheel. Communication between crewmen relied on shouted words. No intercom existed. Every feature reflected compromise. The armor thickness, 12 mm front, 8 mm sides, 6 mm rear, and 6 mm on top, could resist rifle bullets but not heavy machine gun fire. Ventilation was poor, and once sealed for combat, internal temperatures could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The tank's riveted seams often leaked under rain, flooding the crew compartment and shorting electrical circuits. Yet to Japanese planners in 1935, these flaws were acceptable. The Hago's small size allowed it to cross bamboo bridges and muddy tracks where Western tanks would founder. Its diesel engine reduced fire risk and simplified logistics in colonies where gasoline was scarce. Its light ground pressure enabled it to move across soft rice paddies and jungle trails. In the doctrine of tropical warfare, it was not a duelist's weapon, but a spearhead for infantry shock. The U.S. reports were clinical in tone, but unmistakably scornful. One document, Ordnance Intelligence Report Number 12, captured Japanese tank. Guadalcanal, 1942, concluded, "The armor affords no protection against heavy-caliber machine guns. The tank represents design philosophy 10 years behind current practice." Yet those same engineers noted something more subtle. The Hago had been built with remarkable precision given Japan's industrial limits. The machining of gears, the cleanliness of castings, and the quality of its diesel engine showed disciplined craftsmanship. It was not incompetence, it was scarcity made doctrine. This scarcity was the invisible architect of Japanese design. Japan lacked high-grade alloy steel and the industrial base for large forgings. Each additional ton of armor required more fuel, stronger bridges, and engines Japan could not yet mass-produce. The Hago's thin plates were not the result of ignorance, but of arithmetic, the arithmetic of an island nation fighting beyond its material means. By 1941, the Hago remained Japan's most common armored vehicle, its production totaling over 2,300 units. It rolled across Luzon, Burma, and Malaya with an aura of success born from untested opposition. But inside its riveted walls, the weaknesses already seen at Khalkhin Gol waited to reappear. That reappearance would come not in Asia's plains, but in its jungles, when the Hago met Allied armor for the first time under fire, and the illusion of Japanese invincibility began to fracture under the weight of 50-caliber reality. In late 1941, the Hago rolled into war across Southeast Asia. Japan's armored doctrine, shaped by Colonel Hara's pre-war theories, found its first proving ground not against tanks, but against colonial garrisons wholly unprepared for mechanized warfare. When the Imperial Japanese Army invaded Malaya on December 8, 1941, their armored spearheads consisted mainly of Type 95 Hagos of the 3rd and 6th Tank Regiments. Opposing them were lightly armed British and Indian troops with obsolete anti-tank rifles and no real armor of their own. At the Battle of Jitra, the first large-scale tank engagement in the Pacific War, Japanese Hagos achieved a stunning breakthrough. Moving through dense rubber plantations that British commanders had believed impassable to armor, the tanks bypassed defensive lines and sowed chaos in the rear. British Bren gun carriers and Boys anti-tank rifles fired desperately at close range. The rounds bounced harmlessly off the tank's sloped plates. In the confusion, Japanese infantry poured through the gaps, and the defenders collapsed. Reports from the field painted the Hago as unstoppable. Lieutenant Colonel Shigeo Gotanda, commanding the 3rd Tank Regiment, wrote to Tokyo, "Our tanks move through terrain the British said no tank could cross. Their soldiers flee at the sight of us." For the first time in modern history, tanks had advanced hundreds of kilometers through jungle roads. That same doctrine repeated itself in the Philippines campaign. When the 2nd Tank Regiment landed at Lingayen Gulf in December 1941, they faced scattered American and Filipino units equipped with outdated M3 Stuart light tanks and field guns. The Hago's speed and reliability allowed the Japanese to exploit gaps and capture key positions before American armor could organize. At the Battle of Baluag on January 31, 1942, Hagos clashed with M3 Stuarts of the U.S. 192nd Tank Battalion. The encounter was brief and violent. In his post-war diary, Sergeant Hajime Hara described the event. "We fired first. Our 37mm rounds struck the enemy's turret. Flames erupted. The Americans retreated. We believed our tank was superior." In reality, the American crews had been ambushed at point-blank range, their visibility limited by dense vegetation. The victories of early 1942 confirmed every illusion the Imperial Army held about its armor. The Hago was lauded as the divine spearhead of tropical conquest. Newspapers printed photographs of tanks rolling past palm trees and surrendering Allied troops. Officers cited these triumphs as proof that agility and courage outweighed steel. But the triumphs concealed the truth. Against properly equipped opponents, the Hago's fragility was catastrophic. American ordnance analysis of destroyed vehicles in Bataan found that .50 caliber fire had pierced turrets and engine decks at ranges beyond 400 nautics. Even 37mm anti-tank guns, once considered obsolete, easily turned Hagos into burning wrecks. Still, within the Imperial Army, a culture of fatal optimism persisted. Tank crews believed that spirit, satian, compensated for technical inferiority. One diary recovered from a knocked-out tank near Clark Field read, "Our armor is thin, but our hearts are thick. Better to burn inside steel than retreat in shame." That faith carried them across Luzon, Burma, and the Malay Peninsula. By February 1942, Japanese tanks rolled into Singapore's city center, the rising sun flag reflected in the waters of the harbor. British generals, stunned at the speed of collapse, cited tanks as decisive. What they didn't realize was that Japan's armored edge depended on geography, surprise, and enemies who lacked the weapons to strike back. Those conditions would not last. Within months, new opponents, trained, supplied, and battle-hardened, would meet the Hago in terrain where speed meant little, and survival depended on armor that could stop a .50 cal bullet. That reckoning began on the islands of the Central Pacific, where the Hago would face a new enemy who never underestimated it and never feared it again. By mid-1942, Japan's light armor doctrine collided head-on with an enemy that had learned fast. On August 21, 1942, during the Battle of the Ilu River on Guadalcanal, the 1st Tank Company of the 11th Regiment launched a night assault intended to crush the Marine perimeter and recapture the vital airstrip at Lunga Point. 17 Hago light tanks advanced single file through the humid darkness, their diesel engines rumbling low, exhausts flickering blue beneath the palms. The Americans were waiting. Marine engineers had prepared obstacles and registered every field of fire. When the lead Hago emerged onto the sandbar at the river's mouth, its commander shouted through the open hatch, urging his men forward. Seconds later, a burst from a .50 caliber Browning ripped through the thin armor, killing the driver instantly. The tank slewed sideways and burst into flames. The others pressed on, blinded by smoke and fire. Sergeant Major Wilfred Rowe of the 1st Marine Division recalled, "They came straight at us like ghosts in the firelight. We could see their silhouettes, small, boxy, with that Japanese star still painted on the front. The .50 cal went through both sides. The tanks burned before they ever reached our lines. Within minutes, every Hago was either burning or disabled. Marines with grenades and satchel charges finished the job. When dawn came, the riverbank was littered with blackened hulls and twisted tracks. The smell of burned oil mixed with the sweet rot of jungle decay. When it was the first large-scale tank battle of the Pacific War, and it ended in annihilation for the attackers. The Battle of Guadalcanal shattered Japan's illusion of armored dominance. The Hago's speed, once an advantage on the roads of Malaya, meant nothing in knee-deep mud. Its gun, effective against trucks and pillboxes, barely dented the sandbag defenses of the Marines. And its armor, that thin, riveted shell, failed against every weapon the Americans brought ashore. Captured examples were towed to the beach for analysis. The ordnance section recorded that standard .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds penetrated the side plates cleanly at 700 mm, and even the front glacis at 400 mm. Marine gunners tested the theory repeatedly. Each burst punched through like paper. One report noted dryly, "Vehicle protection comparable to a commercial boiler." Yet the Japanese command drew the wrong lessons. Convinced that Guadalcanal's defeat resulted from poor coordination rather than design failure, they redeployed Hagos to new island garrisons, Tarawa, Betio, Peleliu, and Saipan, believing the tanks could still serve as mobile bunkers. It was an error that would turn every later engagement into a massacre. When the Marines landed at Tarawa Atoll in November 1943, 13 Hagos of the 7th Independent Tank Company waited behind sand berms and coconut log walls. Their commanders, trained to charge, now faced an enemy landing with naval artillery and air superiority. As soon as the tanks rolled forward onto the beach, 5-inch naval gunfire and bazookas from the assault waves tore them apart. Private First Class Henry Donovan of the 2nd Marine Division wrote afterward, "We saw one come down the beach, guns firing. A bazooka hit it in the side, went right through. Another one took a .50 cal burst through the turret ring and stopped dead. It was like shooting through a tin roof." Of the 13 Hagos deployed at Tarawa, 12 were destroyed within an hour. The 13th, bogged in a shell crater, was captured intact and sent to Hawaii for testing. Engineers stripped its armor, measured each plate, and fired both .30 and .50 caliber weapons at standard ranges. The conclusion was damning. The Type 95 affords negligible protection against heavy machine gun fire. Vulnerable from all aspects. By the end of 1943, the Hago's time as a combat tank was effectively over. It would survive only as a static pillbox buried to the turret ring and used as artillery. For the Marines who first met it, the vehicle became a symbol of Japan's overconfidence. The moment when the myth of invincibility burned away in the sulfur air of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. And as wrecks of the Hago rusted beneath Pacific suns, American technicians began to study them carefully, not to fear them, but to understand how an empire could send men to die inside steel so thin that a machine gun could pierce it clean through. That study, conducted by ordnance teams and battlefield engineers, would reveal how disbelief turned to laughter, and laughter into analysis. When the captured Hagos arrived at ordnance depots in Espiritu Santo and later at Aberdeen Proving Ground, disbelief turned into documentation. Technicians accustomed to the mass and solidity of American armor found themselves examining what looked like a child-scale model. The steel was thin enough to flex under hand pressure. The rivets protruded like nails hammered into sheet metal. Sergeant Ernest Blake, an ordnance specialist who oversaw early testing in 1943, recorded in his logbook, "We first thought it was a mock-up. The armor rang like tin when struck. I could drive a chisel halfway through a side plate with a single hammer blow." The tank's stripped-down design fascinated American engineers. It was functional, even ingenious in places. The diesel engine, light suspension, and narrow tracks were well crafted. But every other element spoke of economy over endurance. At the proving range, the Marines and Army testers put numbers to their impressions. Standard: 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds penetrated the Hagos' frontal armor at 400 mm and its sides at 800 mm. The thin belly plate could be pierced by a single grenade blast beneath the hull. Armor-piercing 30 caliber rifle rounds dented the turret from 50 meters. When ordnance officers compared these results with those of the M3 Stuart, the contrast was embarrassing. The American light tank's front armor measured 38 mm, triple the Hagos' thickness, and could resist most field guns below 37 mm caliber. News of these tests spread quickly through Marine ranks. The once mystified Japanese tank terror became a running joke. Training films produced by the Navy in 1943 depicted Marines calmly engaging Hagos with machine guns, grenades, and even rifle grenades. The voiceover narration was dry. "The enemy's tank is light. Its armor is thin. Confidence and marksmanship will defeat it." But among ordnance officers, the laughter carried a deeper tone, analytical, even pitying. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert M. Linsky, Chief of Ordnance Analysis for Pacific Forces, wrote in a 1944 report, "The Type 95's construction reflects not incompetence, but national limitation. Japan cannot produce thicker armor plate in sufficient quantity to justify medium designs. The light tank, therefore, becomes not a tactical choice, but an economic necessity." Captured crew equipment reinforced that conclusion. Hago interiors lacked radios. Coordination relied on hand signals or colored flags. The optical sight for the main gun had no range markings beyond 1,000 meters. Ammunition racks were unprotected, and fuel lines ran through the crew compartment. Everything about the vehicle betrayed a nation at the industrial edge of its capabilities. To the Marines who encountered the tanks firsthand, the irony was profound. The same Japanese soldiers who fought with near-suicidal courage at Edson's Ridge and Tarawa had been sent into battle inside machines that offered them no real chance of survival. Corporal Dan Myers, who fought at Tarawa, described one wreck in his diary. "You could see where the 50s went through and out the other side. The driver never had a prayer. It's strange. They fought so hard, but their machines were made of paper." In early 1944, the captured Hago at Aberdeen became a teaching exhibit for armored schools. Students and officers studied its components as examples of how not to build a tank. Demonstrations were held comparing .50 cal fire against the Japanese vehicle and against an American Stuart. In every trial, the Hago was perforated completely, while the Stuart's armor held firm. The visual proof made a lasting impression. Yet some American analysts urged caution against underestimating Japan's innovation. The Hago's lightness, they noted, gave it exceptional mobility in terrain where heavier vehicles bogged down. Its air-cooled diesel and low ground pressure made it ideal for tropical operations. Captain Harry R. Adams of the U.S. Armored Board wrote privately, "The Japanese did not attempt to copy our tanks because their environment forbade it. In the jungles, a 30-ton tank is useless. Their 7-ton vehicle, while fragile, could go places ours could not." Still, battlefield evidence showed that even in its intended environment, the Hago had become obsolete. As the Pacific War intensified, Marines encountered them as static bunkers, dug in, immobile, their engines removed. In such cases, the thin armor served only to channel the shock of high explosives inward. When demolition teams used satchel charges or 37mm anti-tank guns, the tanks often burst apart at the seams, rivets flying like shrapnel. Photographs circulated through unit briefings. Marines standing beside captured Hagos, smiling, hands resting on armor they could pierce with a rifle. The laughter was real, but beneath it lay a professional curiosity. American soldiers were witnessing, perhaps without realizing it, the end of an entire philosophy of warfare, one that believed discipline and daring could compensate for material inferiority. When the testing concluded, the ordnance summary closed with a single line that became infamous in post-war reports. In the Type 95, courage rides in armor too thin to matter. That line would echo across the Pacific as new American units prepared for the next campaigns. They knew what their .50 calibers could do. They also knew from the piles of wrecked Hagos left in the jungles that the mathematics of penetration and protection had shifted permanently. The next phase would quantify that shift, turning laughter into cold arithmetic, and proving beyond doubt why the Hago had no place on a modern battlefield. When ordnance officers compiled the firing tables in 1944, the results revealed the stark arithmetic that defined the Hago's fate. Combat had already shown the outcome, but now the data confirmed it. A .50 caliber Browning M2 firing armor-piercing rounds at 890 mm could penetrate 20 mm of homogeneous steel at 500 mm. The Hago's armor, at its thickest point, was 12 mm. The equation was merciless. Even before American tanks or anti-tank guns entered the field, every Marine heavy machine gun was already a tank killer. At close range, a single burst from the M2 cut through the side plating and out the other wall, leaving daylight streaming through both holes. Testers at Aberdeen called the phenomenon through lighting. Field photographs showed Marines pushing cleaning rods cleanly from one side to the other. The riflemen who had once feared Japan's invincible armor now joked that the Hago offered better ventilation than protection. The American M3 Stuart, its closest weight class counterpart, illustrated the gap in design philosophy. The Stuart's front armor measured 38 mm, its sides 25 mm, and its turret 51 mm at the thickest point. The Stuart's 37 mm M6 gun, firing AP ammunition at 884 mm, could penetrate 46 centimeters at 500 meters, nearly quadruple the Hago's resistance threshold. When the two vehicles met, the duel lasted seconds. In February 1943, during the Battle of Bunagona, a single platoon of Australian M3s destroyed 6 Hagos in under 5 minutes. Reports noted that most Japanese rounds bounced harmlessly off the Stuart's glacis, while the Australians' first salvos ripped open the Hagos like tin cans. Lieutenant Robert G. Richards, an Australian tank commander, described it bluntly. "We didn't fight tanks, we executed them." The figures told the same story in colder terms. Against .50 cal fire, the Hago's survival probability at 300 memos was less than 3%. Against 37mm cannon fire, it was effectively zero. Even mortars firing high-angle shrapnel rounds could perforate the vehicle's top plate. Every calculation ended with the same conclusion. The Hago existed outside the survivability curve of modern armored combat. But American analysts went further, comparing Japan's entire armored portfolio to U.S. standards. By 1943, the average American medium tank, the M4 Sherman, carried 63 millimeters of frontal armor and a 75 80 millimeter gun capable of piercing 80 millimeters at 500 meters. Japan's heaviest operational tank, the Type 97 Chiha, carried just 25 millimeters at the front and a gun half as powerful. The numbers illustrated an industrial divide that no amount of bravery could bridge. To the U.S. military, these statistics weren't mockery. They were confirmation of why Japanese armor had never developed beyond the light category. Production figures explain the rest. Japan's entire wartime tank output from 1939 to 1945 totaled roughly 2,500 vehicles. The United States produced 49,000 Shermans, 22,000 Stuarts, and over 50,000 half-tracks and self-propelled guns. Steel, fuel, and machine tools dictated battlefield outcomes long before soldiers fired a shot. Cinematographers filming training reels in 1944 used the Hago as a live target to demonstrate penetration patterns. At 200 mmol, a burst of 50 cal fire stitched through the armor like cloth. At 400 mmol, the same burst tore open seams along the riveted plates. Even 20 millimeter aircraft cannon rounds obliterated the hull completely. These sequences, later included in ordnance training films, served as warnings not to underestimate enemy courage, but also as proof of how far Japan lagged behind. Marines in the field summarized it more simply. In one report from the Marshall Islands, a platoon sergeant wrote, "You don't need a tank to kill their tanks, just a tripod and a steady hand." The Hago, once the proud symbol of Japanese expansion, had become a mathematical casualty. Its equations of speed and mobility rendered meaningless by new constants of penetration and power. And behind those equations lay a deeper story. A nation that had built its weapons for the wars it wanted to fight, not the war it actually faced. The reasons for that failure weren't tactical or even technological. They were industrial. To understand why Japan kept producing thin-skinned tanks long after they had proven worthless, one had to look not at battlefields, but at factories and the limits of an empire running out of steel, fuel, and time. By 1944, Japan's tank problem was no longer tactical. It was structural. The Type 95 Hago had become a symbol of industrial restraint masquerading as doctrine. While American factories poured out thousands of armored vehicles each month, Japan's entire production system could barely sustain a few hundred per year. The reasons were rooted in the very fabric of the empire's economy, forged long before the first Hago ever rolled from Mitsubishi's workshops. Japan possessed little domestic iron ore and virtually no high-grade coal. Its pre-war industrial strength depended on imports from Korea, Manchuria, and Southeast Asia. When the Pacific blockade tightened after 1942, those lifelines snapped. The Imperial Japanese Army faced an impossible equation. It needed tanks to hold its conquered territories, but it lacked the steel, fuel, and engines to build them. The Hago, therefore, remained in production not by preference, but by necessity. Factory records from Mitsubishi's Sagami arsenal reveal the desperate improvisation behind wartime output. Armor plates were thinned to conserve steel. Rubber components were replaced with crude substitutes made from local latex. And electrical wiring often used salvaged copper stripped from civilian infrastructure. In one 1943 inspection report, engineers noted that shortage of tool steel has reduced machining precision by 30%. Even the rivets holding Hago armor together were produced from recycled ship fittings. By contrast, American production had become a storm of steel and electricity. The United States Steel Corporation produced more armor plate in 1 week than Japan could in an entire year. In 1943, Detroit's Chrysler Tank Arsenal assembled 500 M4 Shermans per month, while Japan's total tank production for that same year barely reached 300 units across all models. The scale gap was so vast that Japanese officers stopped comparing numbers altogether. The resource crisis extended to engines. Japan's automotive industry, small and fragmented, lacked the capacity to produce high-output diesels. The Mitsubishi 120 horsepower unit used in the Hago was reliable but underpowered. Heavier tanks like the Type 97 Chiha required more torque than the industry could supply. Engineers proposed new 200 horsepower designs, but shortages of aluminum and precision tools made mass production impossible. As a result, nearly every Japanese tank, from the Hago to the Chiha, shared the same power plant lineage, limiting growth potential. Fuel was another invisible constraint. Japan's refineries produced a fraction of the gasoline and diesel required for mechanized warfare. By 1943, the Army rationed armored units to minimal training hours, often less than 20 kilometers of driving per month per vehicle. Tanks became static weapons, buried to the turret ring and used as fortified bunkers. Without logistics to move them, even the most advanced designs were useless. Allied bombing deepened the crisis. From 1944 onward, B-29 raids targeted Japan's steelworks at Yawata and its industrial hubs around Kobe and Nagoya. Each attack further disrupted supply chains. One post-war analysis estimated that tank component production dropped by 60% after March 1945. When American troops landed on Okinawa, the Japanese tanks defending the island, mostly Hagos, had been assembled from scavenged parts, their engines stripped from disabled vehicles. Strategically, Japan's leadership failed to adapt. The Imperial Navy monopolized fuel and steel for shipbuilding, leaving the Army to fight its wars on starvation budgets. When Colonel Hara and his team proposed modernizing the tank fleet after the defeats in Burma and the Solomons, the plan was rejected. The General Staff argued that tanks were secondary in island warfare and that spiritual strength would compensate for material weakness. "Weapons are extensions of the soul," one staff memorandum declared. "Victory will come from faith, not metal." This philosophy, hardened even as evidence, proved it wrong. Field commanders on Saipan and Peleliu begged for heavier armor and better guns. Tokyo responded by sending more Hagos. When the Americans landed, those tanks became instant casualties. In one after-action report from Saipan, U.S. Marines recorded destroying 22 Hagos in under 10 minutes with machine guns, bazookas, and Sherman fire. The Japanese crews fought to the last, but their vehicles provided no protection. By 1945, Japanese factories turned to desperate measures. Steel was replaced with mild plate. Wooden mock-ups were used for training, and blueprints for new designs like the Type 4 Chito remained unfinished when the war ended. Only 6 prototypes were ever completed. When Allied occupation forces later toured Mitsubishi's facilities, they found half-assembled hulls beside bombed-out assembly lines and warehouses filled with rusting rivets. Post-war investigators from the U.S. Army Ordnance Department summarized the situation bluntly. Japan's armored forces failed not for lack of courage or intellect, but for lack of industry. The Type 95 remained in service because nothing better could be built. The contrast was not just material. It was philosophical. While America treated technology as a tool of manpower preservation, Japan saw it as a test of spirit. The Hago embodied that contradiction, a machine built by skilled hands, driven by brave men, but conceived in denial of arithmetic. When the empire finally collapsed in August 1945, thousands of Hagos were still scattered across Asia, abandoned in Burma's jungles, buried under volcanic ash in the Marianas, rusting on the beaches of the Philippines. They had outlived the factories that made them. And as American soldiers inspected these wrecks, they saw more than relics. They saw a nation that had fought a modern war with pre-industrial tools, courage without steel, faith without fuel, and tanks that could not survive a single burst from a Browning. The laughter that had greeted the first captured Hago on Guadalcanal would return once more, quieter now, tinged with respect. Because by the war's end, even the victors understood that behind the absurdity of those thin steel plates lay a tragedy, measured not in armor thickness, but in human resolve that had nowhere left to hide. From the beaches of Guadalcanal to the ruins of Tokyo, the Hago's story had come full circle, a testament to what happens when strategy outpaces industry, and when the courage of men must carry the weight that machines cannot. And in that paradox, the war's final lesson would emerge, one that turned the Marines' laughter into reflection as they realized what those little tanks had truly represented. When the Pacific War ended in August 1945, the Type 95 Hago had become both relic and symbol. From the jungles of Burma to the beaches of Okinawa, its rusting hulls marked the trail of an empire's overreach. To the U.S. Marines who first encountered it on Guadalcanal, it had once embodied the unknown menace of Japanese war power. 3 years later, it stood as the most recognizable monument to Japan's defeat, a museum piece of misplaced confidence. In 1946, American occupation troops cataloged the remnants of Japan's armored force. They found over 1,300 Hagos scattered across the former empire, half buried in coral sand, others stripped for scrap. At Yokohama, a row of them was lined up for photographers beside captured Shermans, the comparison almost comical. The Hago's turret barely reached the Sherman's glacis. Its gun, slender as a pipe, looked more like an antique field piece than a weapon of modern war. Yet for those who had fought against them, the laughter carried a strange reverence. Marines remembered the courage of the crews who had driven those fragile machines into hopeless battles. Corporal Dan Myers, who had once written that the Hago was made of paper, later revised his view. They knew they wouldn't come back, he told an interviewer in 1962. They drove anyway. You've got to respect that. Historians would later frame the Hago as a lesson in strategic blindness, the danger of mistaking early victories for proof of perfection. The same tank that had rolled triumphantly through Malaya and the Philippines had proven worthless against America's firepower. Japan's early conquest had concealed the flaws of its industry, and by the time the truth emerged, it was too late to change course. Technically, the Hago was already obsolete before the Pacific War began. Its thin armor and underpowered gun were artifacts of an earlier generation, when Japan had fought opponents with rifles and field guns rather than tanks and aircraft. But its persistence reflected something deeper, a belief that spirit could substitute for steel, and that courage could compensate for production numbers. American analysts at Aberdeen saw the paradox clearly. In their 1946 summary report, they wrote, "The Japanese light tank program represents the triumph of doctrine over reality. It was a weapon born of necessity, sustained by faith and destroyed by physics." The phrase circulated widely in post-war ordnance circles, later quoted in military academies as a cautionary note. For the Marines, the Hago became an unintentional teacher. Every rusting hull on a Pacific island reminded them that victory depended not on bravery alone, but on the material systems that sustained it. Engineers studying the captured tanks traced the lineage of their own machines, from the Stuart to the Sherman to the Pershing, and understood how production, logistics, and technology had shaped every outcome. In 1949, one of the surviving Hagos was shipped to Quantico for display at the Marine Corps Museum. Veterans would walk past it in silence. Its armor still bore the perforations from 50 caliber rounds fired on Guadalcanal. Clean, perfect circles of metal torn open by math. Nearby, a placard read, "Captured Type 95 Hago Light Tank, Guadalcanal, 1942. Proof that courage alone cannot stop a bullet." Decades later, in the humid jungles of the Solomon Islands, fragments of those same tanks still surface after heavy rains. Their steel, once bright with the rising sun, lies dull and pitted with rust. Locals use the hollow hulls as chicken coops or storage sheds. The jungle has reclaimed them, vines twisting through open hatches, rainwater filling the compartments where men once sat waiting for orders that could only end one way. The laughter of 1942 echoing across that river bank on Guadalcanal has long since faded. What remains is something quieter, an understanding that history often disguises tragedy as irony. The Hago, the tank that made Marines laugh, had also carried some of the bravest soldiers Japan ever sent to war. In the end, its story is not about weakness or ridicule, but about the limits of belief when confronted by reality. The 50 caliber bullets that went straight through it did more than destroy steel. They pierced an empire's illusion, revealing that even the fiercest will cannot withstand the arithmetic of war. From the shattered jungles of the Pacific to the quiet museums of peace, the Hago endures as a reminder. In modern warfare, faith may start the engine, but only steel decides how far it can go.